Imagine paying nearly $7 for a single gallon of gas, not in some remote corner of the country, not during a natural disaster, just on a regular Tuesday, pulling into a gas station an hour outside of Los Angeles. That is the reality millions of Americans are living right now. And while people are struggling at the pump, while airlines are shutting down, while families are cutting back on groceries just to afford the drive to work, the President of the United States is standing at a podium calling this a little detour. A war that has already claimed 13 American lives. A war that has pushed gas prices up 50% in just 10 weeks. A war that nobody voted for. And yet the man responsible is telling the country the economy is booming. The stock market is hitting records. Everything is fine. But the numbers tell a completely different story. 62% of Americans disapprove of the job Donald Trump is doing right now. That is an all-time high. And the tension between what the White House is saying and what everyday Americans are actually feeling is about to reach a breaking point. To understand how America got here, you have to go back just a few months, before the war, before the gas prices, before the chaos. The Strait of Hormuz, a narrow waterway in the Middle East, carries roughly a fifth of the world's entire oil and natural gas supply. Every single day, massive tankers loaded with energy pass through that corridor, keeping global economies moving, keeping gas stations stocked, keeping airline routes affordable. It is one of the most critical choke points on the planet. And then Donald Trump started a war. Within weeks, that waterway became a battlefield. Iranian forces began targeting commercial ships. The U.S. Navy moved in to protect them. And almost overnight, the price of oil began climbing in ways that economists had not seen in years. The ripple effect was immediate. Jet fuel costs doubled, trucking costs surged, and at every gas station across America, the numbers on those big roadside signs kept going up and up and up. Families who were already stretched thin after years of post-pandemic recovery suddenly found themselves choosing between filling up the tank and putting food on the table. And here is the part that made people genuinely angry. This was not a surprise attack. This was not a sudden, unavoidable crisis. Analysts, foreign policy experts, and military advisors had all raised red flags. The warning signs were there, but the administration moved forward anyway. And now, 10 weeks into a conflict, the president himself casually calls a mini-war. 13 American service members are dead, gas is pushing $5, $6, even $7 a gallon in some states, and a major American airline has just announced it is shutting down entirely, citing the oil crisis as the final blow. Spirit Airlines, gone. And it will not be the last, because the pressure building inside this economy is unlike anything most Americans have felt since the darkest days of the pandemic. And what made the situation even more alarming was not just what was happening on the ground, it was what was happening inside the White House. Because while Americans were suffering, the president was busy doing something that almost nobody could believe. He was hosting a small business event at the White House, smiling, celebrating, telling the room that the American economy was doing record business, that the stock market was hitting all-time highs, that everything, despite what people were seeing with their own eyes, was going beautifully. And somewhere across the country, a single mother was doing the math at a gas station, trying to figure out if she could afford to fill up her tank and still make rent that week. That contrast, that enormous painful gap between the reality inside the White House and the reality on the streets of America is what made this moment so significant. Because this was not just a political story, this was a human story. And it was getting worse by the day. Let's talk about the numbers for a second, because the numbers are impossible to ignore. Since Donald Trump took office, economists tracking the situation estimate that roughly $7 billion has been pulled out of the American economy every single day. Every single day. That adds up to approximately $2.7 trillion in new debt placed on the shoulders of future generations. Now, some people hear a number like that and they think, well, that is a problem for my grandchildren, not for me. But here is what those people are missing. That debt is not sitting quietly in some distant future. It is showing up right now. It is showing up every time you stop for gas, every time you check out at the grocery store, every time you look at your monthly rent and realize it has gone up again and your paycheck has not. The national average for a gallon of regular gas has now hit $4.46. That is a 50% increase since the start of the war. 50% in 10 weeks. And a new Washington Post and ABC News poll found that half of all Americans believe gas prices are going to get even worse over the next 12 months. Not better, worse. People are not expecting relief. They are bracing for more pain. And that is a level of public pessimism that politicians should be terrified of, especially with the 2026 midterm elections now less than 6 months away. But the pain is not just at the pump, it is layered. It is compounding. Think about the people who were already struggling before this war started. Industries that never fully recovered from the pandemic. Restaurants that are still trying to claw their way back. Healthcare workers who burned out during COVID and are still dealing with the emotional and financial fallout years later. Hospitality businesses that rebuilt from scratch only to find themselves facing another economic shock they did not cause and cannot control. These people were not starting from a position of strength. They were already running on fumes, and now the fumes cost $7 a gallon. And then there is the housing market. Nobody is talking about it enough. Young people, millennials who did everything right, who went to college, got degrees, built careers, are still unable to afford to buy a home. Not because they are irresponsible, because the market has priced them out entirely. And it is not just first-time buyers, it is families. It is older workers who are watching their retirement savings get eaten away by an unstable economy and are quietly asking themselves whether they can even afford to stop working. One college professor put it plainly. He said he knows graduating students who cannot find jobs that let them move out of their parents' homes. He knows professionals in their 40s who can no longer afford to send their own children to the same universities they attended. And he knows seniors in their mid-60s who are white-knuckling their jobs because retiring right now feels financially impossible. 3 generations, all struggling at the same time, with no clear plan in sight. And then came Spirit Airlines. If you wanted one single image that captured everything wrong with this economic moment, it was Spirit Airlines announcing that it was shutting down completely. Not merging, not restructuring, shutting down. The airline released a statement that was devastating in its simplicity. It said that the sudden and sustained rise in fuel prices in recent weeks ultimately left them with no alternative but to pursue an orderly wind down of the company. Jet fuel accounts for roughly a quarter of an airline's entire operating budget, and since the start of Trump's war, that cost has doubled. Spirit was already in a difficult position before any of this began, but it was manageable. The war made it unmanageable, and the reason this matters beyond just one airline going under is what Spirit represented. Spirit was not the airline of wealthy travelers. It was the airline of the working class. It was the airline of the plumber who needed to fly out of state for a job, the college student trying to get home for a break, the small business owner traveling on a tight budget. When Spirit disappeared, it was not just a company closing. It was a lifeline being cut for millions of ordinary Americans. And the reaction from the administration? Silence. No bailout. No acknowledgement. Nothing. Because this was a company that had championed diversity and inclusion initiatives, which made it politically inconvenient for the Trump White House to even appear sympathetic. And that insensitivity, that cold, calculated indifference to real human suffering, was starting to register with people across the political spectrum. Even those who had given Trump the benefit of the doubt were beginning to ask serious questions. Meanwhile, at the Strait of Hormuz, the situation was not stabilizing, it was escalating. The U.S. escalating. Military announced it had sunk 6 Iranian boats in the waterway. The Pentagon said Iran had been targeting commercial ships. Iran said something different. And somewhere in the middle of those competing claims, the truth was getting buried under layers of political spin and military posturing. Foreign policy experts who had worked in both Republican and Democratic administrations were watching this unfold with growing alarm. One former special envoy described the situation as a game of chicken where one of the players, the American one, was zigzagging unpredictably, with no clear objective and no visible off-ramp. The Iranians, he said, did not even know what the president wanted. And if the other side in a negotiation does not know what you want, there is no negotiation, there is just chaos. And chaos, as it turns out, is incredibly expensive. Reuters was reporting that fuel rationing was becoming a real possibility in parts of Asia and Europe. The head of the International Transport Association was warning of supply disruptions that could ripple across global markets for months, possibly years. Economists were using words like recession and shock and sleepwalking. The markets, bizarrely, were still showing signs of optimism, which experts described as misplaced euphoria, a dangerous disconnect between financial indicators and the actual grinding reality facing hundreds of millions of people around the world. And back home, the president's approval rating had dropped to 27% among independent voters. The people who decide elections, the people without a party loyalty to fall back on. They were looking at everything happening and making a very clear judgment. And just when it seemed like the pressure could not possibly build any further, a new development emerged that would force the entire country to confront something even deeper, something that went beyond gas prices and war, something that cut straight to the heart of American democracy itself. In the American South, specifically in the state of Alabama, Republican lawmakers had just called a special legislative session, not to address gas prices, not to discuss the war, not to help struggling families or small businesses or laid-off airline workers. They called this special session to redraw congressional maps, to reshape the boundaries of voting districts in a way that would dilute the political power of black voters. Again, and the reason this felt like such a gut punch, the reason it landed so hard in the middle of everything else happening in the country, was the history behind it. This was not a new fight. This was the same fight that Black Americans in the South had been having for decades, for generations, dressed up in new legal language and presented as routine political procedure. But nobody was fooled. Here's the context that makes this so significant. The congressional district currently represented by Democratic Congressman Shamari Figures exists because the previous Alabama map was found by a federal court to have violated the Voting Rights Act. It had illegally diluted Black voting power, and the judges who made that ruling were not liberal activists. Two of them had been appointed by Donald Trump himself. One had originally been appointed by Ronald Reagan. Conservative judges, looking at the evidence, came to the conclusion that Alabama had discriminated against Black voters. The Supreme Court upheld that decision, and yet here were Alabama Republicans convening a special session, asking the Supreme Court to let them go back to the old map, the map that had already been ruled discriminatory, the map that had already been thrown out. They wanted it back. Congressman Figures said it plainly. This is not about any one politician's seat. This is about whether Black voters in the American South have a real voice in their own government. And in Montgomery, Alabama, the birthplace of the civil rights movement, the city where people marched and bled and died for the right to vote, residents were watching this unfold with a kind of pain that went beyond politics. One voter looked directly into a camera and said it was blatant racism. No hesitation, no qualification, just the plain truth as they saw it. And across the country, people were starting to connect the dots between everything happening at once. The war no one voted for, the gas prices no one could afford, the airline that just disappeared, the polling numbers that the president called fake, and now this, a coordinated effort in multiple southern states, Alabama and Florida both moving simultaneously to reshape the democratic process itself in ways that would make it harder for certain Americans, specifically Black Americans, to make their voices heard. Florida's new congressional map was already facing a legal challenge within hours of being signed into law. A lawsuit filed the same day alleged it violated the state constitution's own ban on partisan gerrymandering, and still, the maps were being drawn, the sessions were being held, the machinery was moving. Because the midterms were coming, and the people in power understood something very clearly. If the economy kept deteriorating, if gas prices kept rising, if the war kept dragging on, they were going to need every structural advantage they could get. And if they could not win the argument, they were going to try to redraw the map. Literally. But what followed next would reveal just how deep the resistance to all of this had become, and why the consequences of this moment were going to echo far beyond any single election. The resistance was already there. It had been building quietly, in living rooms and church halls and community centers, in the conversations people were having with their neighbors, in the way ordinary Americans were looking at their gas receipts and their grocery bills and their rent notices, and asking themselves out loud how much more of this they were expected to absorb. And the answer, increasingly, was not much more. Political analysts looking at the 2026 midterms were not seeing a party that could recover from this. They were seeing a map, and not the gerrymandered kind, of a country that had lost confidence in its leadership at nearly every level. Independent voters, the people who had given Trump a second chance, had dropped their approval to 27%. That is not a dip, that is a collapse. And history shows that when independent voters move that decisively, they do not come back quickly. The damage tends to stick. Foreign policy experts were warning that even after the war eventually ended, the economic tail effect would linger for months, possibly years. Oil markets do not snap back overnight. Supply chains that were disrupted take time to rebuild. Airlines that shut down do not reopen. Jobs that disappeared during a crisis do not always return. And the countries around the world that had nothing to do with any of this, the low and middle income nations now facing food scarcity and commodity shortages because of a war they never asked for, they would be paying the price long after the headlines moved on. The human cost of this moment stretched far beyond American borders, and that weight, quiet as it was real. Back in Montgomery, Alabama, in the city where the modern fight for voting rights was born, people were not giving up. They were organizing. They were showing up. They were doing what that city has always done when the forces of suppression came knocking. They were pushing back because that is what this country, at its best, has always done. And that is what made this moment, as painful and as complicated and as heavy as it was, still feel like the beginning of something rather than the end. The story of what happens next belongs to the American people, and right now, they are paying very close attention. If this story made you think, if it made you feel something, drop your thoughts in the comments below. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more stories like this told straight, no spin, no noise, just the truth, make sure you like this video and subscribe, because there's a lot more coming and you do not want to miss it.